Welcome everybody to another Medic Academy lecture review. The topic of discussion for this afternoon will be cardiology. Hey everybody, Chris here. I'd like to thank you for tuning in for this lecture review series on cardiology. This is going to be the first part of a several part series just because it's such an in-depth topic of discussion, such a large topic of discussion. The first video we're going to do is we're going to review the basic anatomy and physiology as it pertains to the cardiovascular system. So what we're going to do is we're going to flip this around to the screen and we'll take it from there. Okay, so we're going to start our review on anatomy and physiology. Now we're going to take a look at the cardiovascular system, and it's composed of three components, one being the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. The heart, of course, is the pump, the blood vessel is the container, and the blood is the fluid. So all of these components have to work together in order to maintain adequate cardiac output and homeostasis. The heart itself is a muscular cone-shaped organ whose main purpose is to pump blood throughout the body and perfuse all the tissues. This is located behind the sternum and is about the size of a closed fist of your patient. The heart muscle is called the myocardium and is surrounded by a thick fibrous membrane called the pericardium. Now this pericardium can be a little bit tricky when we start talking a little bit about pathology regarding things such as a pericardial tamponade. The heart consists of four chambers, two atria and two ventricles. The atria are located in the upper part of the heart, and the ventricles are located in the lower part. If we look at this diagram, we're going to look at the anatomical view of the heart. And what we would like to point out and notice that this left ventricle right here is thicker than the right ventricle. That's due to the fact that the left ventricle has to pump blood further than the right ventricle has to pump. So as blood passes through the heart, it has to go through these valves. Now think of these valves as a gate, a one-way gate that keeps blood from backflowing or regurgitating from which it came. So blood passing from the atria to the ventricles have to flow through two atrioventricular valves. These valves are termed the tricuspid valve and the mitral valve. Now the tricuspid valve separates the right atrium from the right ventricle, and the mitral valve separates the left atrium from the left ventricle. There's also two semilunar valves, which divide the heart from the aorta and the pulmonary artery. We have the pulmonic valve, which is the first semilunar valve, and it regulates blood from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery. And then the aortic valve, which regulates blood from the left ventricle to the aorta. There are two large veins that return deoxygenated blood from the body back to the right atrium, and this is known as the superior vena cava as well as the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava returns blood from the upper part of the body, whereas the inferior vena cava returns blood from the lower part of the body. So freshly oxygenated blood is returned to the left atrium through the pulmonary veins. This is after it goes through the pulmonary circulation and becomes oxygenated. It then flows through the mitral valve into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then pumps this oxygenated blood to the aorta through the aortic valve and then into the rest of the body. Now the aorta is the body's largest artery and is divided into three main areas. And the left ventricle, as I said, is the strongest cardiac chamber. So let's take a look at the electrical conduction system. Now, the mechanical pumping action of the heart only occurs after it's stimulated by electrical impulse. And we see this electrical impulse on an EKG strip when we perform an EKG. The brain partially controls the heart rate and the strength of contraction through the autonomic nervous system. Now, if you look back at our previous lecture on the nervous system, then this will clear it up a little bit when we start talking about the autonomic nervous system control of the heart. The heart itself can, however, generate its own contractions due to its special electrical tissues. This is termed automaticity. Taking a look at the electrical conduction system, we're going to start here at the SA node. The SA node, or the sinoatrial node, is the body's main pacemaker, and it has an intrinsic firing rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. So if you think back to normal vital signs, a normal pulse rate is, of course, 60 to 100. So following conduction from the SA node, it travels through these intranodal pathways until it reaches the AV node. Now, the AV node is a secondary pacemaker, so that if the SA node fails to fire, then the AV node can take it up from there. Now, this AV node has an intrinsic firing rate of 40 to 60 beats per minute. And the main job of this AV node, however, is to slow impulses coming from the SA node before it reaches the ventricles, because we want these ventricles to have a slower rate of contraction than the atria, due to the fact that it takes these ventricles longer to fill with blood than it does the atria, simply because they are larger. So following the AV node, we come down to the bundle of His, where it branches into the left bundle branch and then into the right bundle branch. And then the left bundle branch is a little bit different and special because we have these fascicles. Now we have a left posterior fascicle and a left anterior fascicle. Now when these become blocked, sometimes you can hear it referred to as a hemiblock. Taking a look at the right bundle branch, this right bundle branch is further broken down into Purkinje fibers. Now, the Purkinje fibers can act as a tertiary pacemaker. However, it only has an intrinsic firing rate of 20 to 40 beats per minute. So if all this becomes blocked in things such as a complete heart block or a third-degree heart block, then we have to rely on cell-to-cell conduction. Now, whereas the heart tissue can conduct electricity autonomically, it is not a very good way to maintain cardiac output. It is not adequate. So if we have to rely on cell-to-cell conduction, it's not going to sustain life very long. Now, in order for us to understand the cardiac electrical conduction system, we have to know a few terms, one being excitability. Now, excitability is the ability of the cells to respond to an actual electrical impulse. This is due to them being a specialized type of cell. We talk about conductivity. Now, conductivity is the ability of the cells to conduct electrical impulses, much like conduit. Then we're going to move to automaticity. Now, automaticity is the ability of these cells to contract spontaneously so that they can form that cell-to-cell conduction and contract they can contract by themselves. So the stimulus originates in the SA node, or the sinoatrial node, and this is controlled by impulses from the brain traveling through the autonomic nervous system. And this autonomic nervous system, as well as hormones and heart tissue, control the heart's chronotropic state, dromotropic state, and inotropic state. Now, when we talk about the chronotropic state, we're talking about the rate of contraction. The dromotropic state, we're talking about the electrical conduction. In the inotropic state, we're talking about the actual strength of contraction. So these three things are controlled by the autonomic nervous system, hormones, as well as heart tissues themselves. Diving a little bit deeper into the autonomic nervous system, we have two parts of this nervous system, one being the sympathetic nervous system, and the second being the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the sympathetic nervous system is our fight or flight system. This system does things such as increase our heart rate, increase our strength of contraction, increase our respiratory rate. It prepares us to either fight or run to save our lives. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, does the exact opposite. This is the feed or breed nervous system. It's also known as the cholinergic nervous system. This nervous system slows the heart rate and it slows the respiratory rate. Now, these systems, think of them as a seesaw. They normally balance each other out to help maintain homeostasis, but at times, one has to outweigh the other. We also depend on receptors in our blood vessels, kidneys, brain, and the heart to help maintain our body's homeostasis. One of these receptors are called baroreceptors. Now, these receptors respond to changes in pressure and are usually located within the heart or main arteries, such as the aortic arch. Then we also have chemoreceptors. Now, chemoreceptors, they sense changes in chemical composition of blood.
It is time for the Boo Thing Minute.
Hey, I'm Boo Shang, and this is the Boo Shang Minute. So, we're going to talk about cardiology. I don't know a lot about that, but thankfully, your instructor does. Now, you see, in the hospital, you have a crash cart that sits outside the patient's room. It's sort of like to ward off evil spirits of anything to make your patient crash. But in the Bamba lamp, you too late for that. You got to come fix it. Sorry. So, when you walk up in your patient's house and you say, "Hello, I'm your EMT. What stupid thing have you just done?" and they don't answer you, they've probably died. So you're going to have to figure that out. They could die from a heart attack. They could have trauma. And if they do have trauma, you need to treat the patient as a whole, not just the hole in the patient. Okay? And they could have stroke, a diabetes, which is apparently a really freaking long name that I cannot say, but somebody else can. It ain't me, but you'll get bored with that later. It's no problem. And if your patient's got drug problems, well, they're not going to tell you because they're going to probably be dead. Don't never worry about that, though, because you, my friend, you have 0.4 milligrams of wake the heck up. The party is over. And hopefully there's an EMT there that can sedate them because they are going to be mad at you. So, whatever the case is, the purpose is you got to bring the patient back. Sometimes you don't want to, but you gotta because you signed up for this. Sorry. Anyway, that's my Boo Thing Minute. I hope y'all enjoy the rest of this boring lecture from my husband.
So that if we were to have, say, a buildup of carbon monoxide, then these chemoreceptors will be responsible for detecting that buildup of carbon monoxide and then adjusting the body's mechanisms to help deal with that and maintain homeostasis. So the cardiac cycle is the process that creates the actual pumping action of the heart. And this begins with the myocardial contraction and ends with the beginning of the next contraction. So it's one complete contraction of the heart. And this results in pressure changes within the heart's chamber. And we can see these pressure changes by ways of things such as auscultating the blood pressure, because we're going to talk a little bit about systole and diastole. So if you remember, when we take a blood pressure, we'll get a systolic number and a diastolic number. Well, the systole or the systolic number that we get is the pressure exerted on the blood vessel walls following this ventricular contraction. So systole would be ventricular contraction and the actual pumping of blood into the circulation. Diastole, however, is the relaxation phase. So this is when the heart is relaxed, filling back up with blood and preparing for another cardiac cycle. Now let's talk a little bit about preload. Now preload is the amount of blood that's returned to the heart to be pumped out. And this is going to be particularly important when we start talking about things such as fluid resuscitation, disease processes such as cardiac congestive heart failure, and as well as even with medications. When we start talking about medications such as nitroglycerin, all this is going to affect preload. Afterload, on the other hand, deals with peripheral vascular resistance. So this is the measurement of resistance that the heart has to pump against. Stroke volume is the amount of blood ejected per one contraction. So one contraction of the heart, the blood that is pumped out of that heart will be the stroke volume. Now, when we measure cardiac output, we're going to measure it by taking stroke volume and multiplying it by the heart rate. And whereas we can't measure stroke volume very well in an ambulance, we can, however, measure heart rate. So let's say, for instance, our stroke volume stays the same and we increase our heart rate by, say, a fluid bolus, or if the patient starts to degrade and the heart rate decreases, and then cardiac output will be affected with that increase or decrease of heart rate. Which leads us to talk a little bit about Starling's law of the heart. Now, Starling's law of the heart is very simple. It says just pretty much to think of the heart fibers as a rubber band. So these fibers are also called sarcomeres. So like we do a rubber band, if we stretch a rubber band and let it go, it'll fly off our hand. So the further we stretch this rubber band to a certain extent and let it go, the further that this rubber band will fly. And it's the same thing with the heart. When we suddenly increased preload. So if we suddenly give fluid, such as like a fluid bolus, then we're going to cause those sacrometer to stretch. And when they rebound back, then we're going to get a stronger contraction of the heart. Now, when we talking about a cardiac output, a good indicator of cardiac output will be peripheral pulses. So if we, for some reason, cannot measure a blood pressure, if we can reach down and feel a radial pulse, then we know that our systolic blood pressure is anywhere between 80 and 90 millimeters of mercury systolic. All right, so we talked about the pump. Let's talk about the blood, the fluid that's contained in that pump. Plasma and formed elements form blood. Now, plasma is the watery straw-colored fluid that makes up more than half of our blood supply. Plasma also has these form elements, also called cells, and they include red blood cells, white blood cells, as well as platelets. Now, blood's main job is to carry oxygen and nutrients to the tissues and carry away waste products from the tissues after metabolism. Red blood cells, they carry oxygen to tissues that are disc-shaped, and they're also called erythrocytes. Now, these contain proteins called hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin attaches to oxygen and carries it throughout the body. Without this hemoglobin, then we would not be able to transport oxygen. Erythropoiesis is the ongoing process by which red blood cells are made, and this normally happens within the bone marrow. Blood cells are constantly dying, so we have to be constantly regenerating these red blood cells to maintain homeostasis. White blood cells are also called leukocytes. Now, while there are several types of leukocytes which all do different jobs, the main job is for these leukocytes to fight infection. Now, these leukocytes can actually directly attack and kill bacterial invaders, so this is our body's fighting force. If we were to catch an infection or our patient were to have an infection, then we should see an increased number of these white blood cells due to the fact that our body is attempting to fight this invasion. Platelets is the last thing we're going to talk about with blood components. Now, platelets are necessary to form clots. And clotting or coagulation is very complex, and it involves platelets, clotting proteins and plasma, other proteins, as well as calcium. Without these platelets, we could not form a clot, and we could simply bleed out. All right, so we talked about the heart, the pump, the blood, which is the fluid. Now let's talk about the pipes, the blood vessels. So arteries carry oxygen-rich blood away from the heart and throughout the body. They further branch into arterioles, which divide further into capillaries. Now, capillaries is where diffusion takes place. So in the capillary beds, oxygen and nutrients are diffused out, and waste products are picked up. So then these capillaries take this deoxygenated blood and waste products and then enlarge into venules. These venules merge and form veins, and veins bring the blood back to the heart, where it's sent to the lungs, reoxygenated, and returned to the heart to be pumped through the body once again. Taking a closer look at blood vessels. The blood vessels has walls, and these walls are composed of 3 layers of tissue. One is the tunica intima, or the endothelium, tunica media, and the tunica adventitia. Now, the tunica intima is the innermost lining of the blood vessel. The tunica media is the middle, and the tunica adventitia is the outermost level. All right, now the heart itself is covered in blood vessels, and these blood vessels are called coronary arteries. Now, these coronary arteries are responsible for fusing the heart with nutrients and oxygen, and they arise as soon as the aorta leaves the left ventricle. Now, we have our right coronary artery, which divides into 9 different branches, and the left coronary artery, which divides into 2 branches and then subdivide further. So if one of these coronary arteries were to become occluded via, say, an embolism, then we were to see signs of a heart attack in these patients. or at least myocardial ischemia, because without being supplied with oxygen and nutrients, this heart tissue becomes sick and it begins to die. Further in our discussion on blood vessels, we're going to talk about pulmonary circulation. Now, pulmonary circulation carries blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs and back from the lungs to the left side of the heart and into systemic arterial circulation. Now, systemic arterial circulation carries blood from the aorta to all the other parts of the body. And as I said, the aorta is the largest artery within the body, and it is divided into three parts. It is ascending aorta, the aortic arch, and the descending aorta. And that's it, everybody. Thank you for watching. Hope you got something out of this presentation. Stay tuned for further installments. With the next installment, Cardiology Lecture Part 2, we'll be talking about pathophysiology as it pertains to the cardiovascular system. Again, thank you for watching. Y'all have a great night.